Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're tracing the fascinating, decades-long evolution of South Carolina's education system. It's really a compelling story, full of high ambitions, some deeply rooted challenges, and this continuous, statewide push to do better for every single student who walks through a classroom door. Here's our roadmap. We're going to hit 5 key areas today. First, the initial demand for better schools. Second, the massive wave of legislative action. Third, the tricky dilemma of school funding. Fourth, the legal battle for equity. And finally, we'll look at where South Carolina education stands today. Let's get to it. All right, Section 1, the demand for better schools, cultural diffusion, and the push for quality. To really understand how we got here, you have to look at how rapidly South Carolina was changing starting back in the 1970s. Looking at teacher Alejandro Victoria with his Spanish class in Duncan, South Carolina, you can really see the shift. Cultural diffusion and a much more diverse state population created brand new, enduring challenges. And honestly, it pushed leaders from both sides of the aisle to focus heavily on improving public education. The economy was evolving, the population was shifting, and the state schools simply had to adapt alongside it. So how did they make sure these new skills were actually being taught? Well, they turned to accountability. Now, what does that mean in this context? Basically, it's about crafting tests to measure student achievement and figure out who the effective teachers are. Lawmakers really leaned into this idea of strict accountability, making sure both students and teachers met very specific standards. You see, it wasn't just about throwing money at the problem. They wanted cold, hard proof that the education was actually working. Moving right along to Section 2, a wave of legislative action, transforming the system from 1977 to 1998. Let's look at how those early demands turned into an absolute flurry of new laws. Following this timeline, it's wild to see how each law built directly on top of the last one. You've got the Education Finance Act in 1977, targeting funding for poorer districts. Literally the next year, boom, high school exit exams are introduced. By 1984, the Education Improvement Act bumps up teacher pay and lengthens the school year. And this relentless march just kept going, with Target 2000 all the way to the Education Accountability Act in 1998. They were steadily ramping up state control, funding, and testing over 2 solid decades. Governor Carroll Campbell's Target 2000, which kicked off in 1989, was incredibly ambitious. It set some very specific, high-reaching goals. We're talking about increasing graduation requirements, slashing the dropout rate, pushing critical thinking skills, improving arts education, and even created half-day programs for at-risk preschoolers. And a cool fact here, business leaders across the state actually chipped in to fund job training programs to help fundamentally raise the bar for every student. Now, did these reforms actually work? Absolutely. They were a massive success. We saw fewer student absences, higher SAT scores, and way more college-bound seniors. In fact, these efforts were so highly praised that Governor Richard W. Riley, the main architect of the 1984 Education Improvement Act, was actually tapped to be the U.S. Secretary of Education under President Clinton. It's a huge deal when state-level success propels someone straight to the national stage like that. All of this momentum culminated in 1998 with the Education Accountability Act. This was a very strict, step-by-step system. First, schools had to adopt statewide standards in core subjects. Next, they tested 3rd through 8th graders every single year. Then, schools got a public grade, ranging from excellent down to unsatisfactory. And get this, if a school consistently performed poorly, the state could literally step in and replace the administration. So yeah, schools were getting very public report cards and facing some incredibly serious consequences if they failed. Okay, Section 3, the school funding dilemma, paying for progress. So here is the giant elephant in the room. How on earth do you fairly pay for all these ambitious new standards and strict accountability measures? Well, look at the dramatic pivot that happened in 2006 with Act 388. Under the old model, citizens paid property taxes based on their homes, cars, and businesses to fund local schools. But Act 388 flipped the script. It completely exempted homeowners. Instead, it shifted that heavy tax burden onto commercial properties, vacation homes, and rentals. Plus, it bumped up the sales tax by a penny. Oh, and it also capped how much local governments could increase taxes. As you might guess, this move was, and still is, extremely controversial. Let's look at the different angles impartially. Supporters fiercely argue that Act 388 is a lifesaver, protecting everyday citizens from out-of-control tax hikes and keeping local government spending in check. On the flip side, critics argue that it completely starves education budgets, right when schools need that money the most. Meanwhile, business owners, they are generally pretty unhappy with having to shoulder this new, much heavier financial burden on their commercial properties. So you have deeply valid arguments on all sides here. Taxpayer relief on one hand and the very real budgetary survival of local schools on the other.
Which brings us to Section 4, the legal battle for equity, Abbeville v. South Carolina.
All of this financial tension was bound to explode into a major clash. Because even with decades of desegregation efforts and tax reforms, deep geographic inequalities just stubbornly refused to go away. We have to talk about disparity. By the late 90s, poor and rural school districts realized this financial disparity was a massive roadblock. They simply could not afford to meet the state's strict new educational standards. The standards were exactly the same for everyone across the state, but the funding to actually achieve them? Absolutely not. So in 1999, these poorer districts decided to sue the state, and their argument hinged right here on Article 11, Section 3 of the South Carolina Constitution. It states, "The General Assembly shall provide for the maintenance and support of a system of free public schools open to all children in the state." The districts argued that handing out funds without taking a district's wealth into account was a blatant violation of this exact constitutional promise.
Now, the timeline of this lawsuit is just agonizingly slow. They filed in 1999. It took 15 years, all the way until 2014, for the court to finally rule that the funding process denied students a minimally adequate education. Huge victory, right? Well, hold on. Just 3 years later, in 2017, the court shockingly reversed its own decision, arguing it had actually overstepped its powers. The legal term here is vacate, which means to cancel or annul a judgment. By choosing to vacate the 2014 Abbeville decision, the court essentially wiped that hard-fought victory for rural schools completely off the books. In the blink of an eye, the legal mandate to fix this massive funding disparity was just gone, left entirely unresolved.
Imagine fighting in court for nearly 2 decades and ending up with that result. It was a crushing defeat. But as this quote from the Abbeville superintendent in 2017 perfectly shows, local educators never gave up. They said, "We are, of course, extremely disappointed that no more equity came out of that lawsuit, but we will continue to strive to do what's best for the students that we serve." They were gutted, sure, but their commitment to their kids didn't waver for a single second. Finally, let's wrap up with Section 5, South Carolina Education Today, the ongoing effort. So after all the laws, the tax shifts, and the long court battles, where are things right now? Well, $11,500. That's the crucial number today. That is roughly what South Carolina currently spends per student. To put that 11.5 grand into perspective, it actually gives South Carolina a solid regional edge. It's more than what neighboring states are spending, which is a great thing. But as we see here, it still lags behind the overall national average. It's a really clear snapshot of a state that has made some incredible strides, but definitely still has some ground to cover. When we look back at nearly 50 years of reforms, from the Education Finance Act of the 70s right through the heartbreak of the Abbeville decision, one thing becomes absolutely clear. Trying to balance strict statewide educational standards with fair, equitable local funding is like walking a continuous tightrope. It doesn't just get fixed overnight. It requires constant attention, adjustment, and reevaluation. So I'm going to leave you with a question to chew on. Based on everything we've uncovered in this explainer, what role do you think everyday civic engagement has played, and will continue to play, in securing fair funding for all students? Because at the end of the day, your local awareness and your engagement are directly tied to the future of these schools. Keep questioning things, keep learning, and thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.